in our Midrash on the Parashah shir this man with Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens. As with every week, Rabbi Lebens is teaching a class directly before this class, so I'm going to do my regular little introduction spiel, and then hopefully he will be here by the time I'm done. So as you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. This just means that if you wish, you can turn on your camera so we can see your lovely smiling faces. And it means that when Rabbi Lebens invites questions or comments, you can unmute and ask them yourself. You are always welcome to put your questions and your comments in the chat, and I will read them out. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, then you can put your comments in the Facebook comments and I can bring them to the Zoom. When you're not speaking, we just ask you to keep yourself on mute. It minimizes the background noise so we can all hear each other. I will be putting a PDF of the sources that we're going to be using in the chat, so you can follow along. But Rabbi Lebens also reads them out. So a little bit about this class. In this class, every week we delve into a selection of Midrashim connected to the Torah portion. And a great thing is it's directly after Shabbat, so we're already preparing for next Shabbat with the Parashah. And this helps us gain insight into the Rabbinic imagination. Whilst we're waiting to get started, I just wanted to let you know about a few other things that are happening at Drisha, since this is the last week of the Zaman. So Drisha will be running an amazing online summer kollel. Applications have closed now for the whole program, but they are still ongoing for the morning classes, which is an amazing Talmud shir with Rabbi Dan Margulies. So you can still apply to be part of that. And there are 2 sessions of 3 weeks, so you can join for 3 weeks or the whole 6 weeks if you so wish. If you have any Talmudot in your life, any middle school or high school girls, there are still a few spots in our summer programs for girls, and you can find those applications also on drisha.org. And I believe Dr. Rabbi Samuel Lebens has joined us, so I will pass it over.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here for our final session together of this semester, although we'll be coming back for more Midrash on the weekly Parashah after the break. And we've already prepared a little bit for Shavuot because we spoke about the connection between Parashat Bamidbar and the festival of Shavuot in last week's class. So I'm just going to march on to look at Parashat Naso, which is the next weekly Parsha. Although I believe in Chutz La'aretz, where you have a 2-day Yom Tov ahead, you won't be reading Parashat Naso this Shabbat. It will still be Shavuot for you, but if I've understood the way it's working. But it will be a regular Shabbat for us. So in Israel, we've got Parashat Naso. And look, it's good for you too, I hope, because you'll be prepared with even more advance notice for Parashat Naso. And I hope you've got the handouts available. And here we go. So Parashat Naso, it's kind of funny because the first few weeks of the book of Bamidbar are about arranging the encampment of the Israelites for this trek across the desert. A formation, how their movements would be directed, how the camp would work, basically. And it was going to be a short trek to the land of Israel, a few days, maybe a few weeks. But it turned into this 40-year odyssey. That's part of the story of the book of Bamidbar. But in a sense, it's strange that in Parashat Naso, a number of really important mitzvot appear that don't have all that much to do with the narrative arc. I'm sorry to raise a question that I'm not going to address, because I'm not going to address it, but it's worth thinking about in your own time. You know, why does the narrative stop for these laws? We made, I think, a big deal of our tour through the book of Vayikra, of trying to make sense, at least a little bit, of why the legal codes are ordered in the way they are. So two of the big laws that emerge at this stage of the book of Bamidbar are the ceremony of the sotah, which is the woman accused of adultery and who has secluded herself against the warnings of her husband with the man, the paramour, the man of who the husband is jealous. I have my own very revisionary and subversive reading of that entire ceremony for a different time. There's also the mitzvot of the Nazir, the Nazirite, which is, I think it's as close as Judaism gets to something like a monastic order. In fact, there are in the Catholic world Nazarene monks and nuns, right? The Nazirite order, a man or a woman can swear an oath to become a Nazir. And the laws of the Nazirut and what that means are set out at this stage in the book of Bamidbar, in Parashat Naso. Again, why did we need to hear that now? Peculiar. I have some theories, but for a different time. Where am I? So I'm just opening up the handout. Here we are. So before we look into the text, what is a Nazirite? So once they've taken the vow, they become commanded in more laws. You know, there's 613 commandments for a normal Jew, let's say, which isn't quite true because some of the 613 are for men, some are for women, some are for Kohanim. But if we use 613 as a symbolic number, you know, those are the mitzvot we're bound by. Then by becoming a Nazirite, you become bound by more. You take upon yourselves new biblical obligations that you don't have unless you're a Nazirite. What are those obligations? Well, one, they have to abstain from wine, which you could, you know, well, wine's an intoxicant, but it's not just that. You see, they have to abstain from wine and from any product derived from grapes altogether. They abstain from cutting their hair, and that includes facial hair. So men and women can be Nazirites, so they're going to have long hair, and the men are going to have beards. 3, they must avoid the ritual impurity that comes from contact with the dead, even from contact with the corpses of their own family, which is like, you know, they're like a, you know, like a high priest or the priests who even for their own family, the high priest, you know, so a priest isn't allowed to become contaminated by the impurity of death. Unless it's for a close relative. And a high priest can't even become ritually impure for a close relative. And the Nazir is like a high priest in that respect. They must avoid the ritual impurity that comes from contact with the dead, even from the contact with the corpses of their own close family. And then they adopt these restrictions. They have to specify a time frame, like how long do they want to be a Nazir for? If they leave it ambiguous, the kind of the standard term was 30 days. So standardly, a Nazir would become a Nazirite for 30 days, but they can specify longer. I think they could even specify shorter. Don't quote me on that. I'm not an expert on the laws of Nazirut. Indeed, they could swear to do it for their entire life. Shimshon, that's Samson, and Shmuel, the prophet, were both lifelong Nazirites. Although in their cases, it's peculiar because they didn't actually choose to become a Nazir. In both cases, they had that status thrust upon them by divine command. In the case of Shimshon, it was a divine command. In the case of Shmuel, it wasn't a command; it was an oath that Hannah made. She said, if I get pregnant, my first child will be a Nazir. So in the case of Shimshon, divine command. In the case of Shmuel, it was through this oath of his mother. But those are two cases of a Nazir who were Nazirim for their entire lives. Now, the interesting thing is, right, if those are the two Nazirim, those are the two personal examples we have of a Nazir, they're very different people, right? Shimshon is a very complex character, and he's almost like an anti-hero in the Bible. He has some merits, and God speaks to him, but he's a difficult character. Seems to be one with very strong physical lust that kind of controls his actions to a large degree. Shmuel is this priestly, disciplined prophet of God who doesn't seem to step a foot wrong when it comes to anything really. What is a Nazir? Is a Nazir a positive thing like a Shmuel, or is it quite a ambivalent thing like a Samson, a Shimshon? That's already kind of you see kind of a biblical ambivalence towards the Nazir, because we've got these two examples, and they're really very different examples. Okay, we're going to see that ambivalence evolve into the Talmud, so into rabbinic texts. But before that, I haven't fleshed out the entire biblical kind of description of a Nazir. I've told you what they are forbidden from doing, but there's also this ceremony that the Nazir has to perform upon ending their period of Nazirut, right? So, for example, if a person becomes a Nazir for a fixed period of time, right, for 30 days, then Parashat Naso will tell them what to do when they finished. And in short, they have to bring three sacrifices to the Mishkan. One of them is an olah offering, a burnt offering. One of them's a peace offering. One of them's a sin offering they have to bring. And the most distinctive part, I think, of this ceremony would be that the Nazirite has to shave all of the hair. That's to say the hair that they've grown throughout the course of their Nazirut. They have to shave all the hair off, and they place it along with the peace offering on the fire of the Mizbeah. So in some senses, I don't want to speak about this either. I've said a lot about the things I don't want to speak about this week, but it's almost as close as we come to human sacrifice, because the Nazir cuts off that which they've grown through the period of their Nazirut on their body, their beard and their hair, or just their hair, in the case of female Nazirot, I suppose. And they put it on the altar, and it goes up with the sacrifice. It's burned to God. There's also a ceremony with the same three offerings, if I'm not mistaken, for a Nazir who unintentionally breaks the terms of his or her oath. They have to go through a very similar ceremony, but then they have to start again because they didn't complete their oath, and they have to start again. Okay, they have to complete what they swore they would complete, and if they broke it, the clock goes back to zero. But before the clock goes back to zero, there's also a ceremony in the temple. Okay, so if we turn now to the source sheet, we'll see how that ambivalence, which I just hinted to in our kind of Shimshon Shmuel, Samson versus Samuel dichotomy in the biblical presentation of Nazirim, we see that ambivalence as I have advertised. We see it unfold into the Talmud, and the first source on the handout is one place in which you can see that ambivalence manifest. In the actual context, I've taken there's some dots. I've kind of shaved it away. Shaved for Nazir, that's appropriate. And look, you see my beard's shorter this week. I've shorn it away from the original context in Masechet Tanit, the tractate of the Babylonian Talmud called Tanit. In context, Rabbi Elazar HaKapar and another Rabbi Elazar, two people called Rabbi Elazar, but one called Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, are arguing actually about fasting, and they're arguing about people who take upon themselves more fasts than they are biblically and rabbinically enjoined to observe. So rabbinically and biblically, there are, 5 fasts, Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av, there's the fast of Gamliel, which happens in between Rosh Hashanah and Tisha Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There is the 17th of Tammuz. There is the 10th of Tevet, right? Those are the 5 fasts that are incumbent upon everybody. But some people take upon themselves more, right? So there was a custom of fasting every Monday and Thursday. There are people who just fast more often. And some people fast every Rosh Chodesh and then call it a Yom Kippur Katan, or on certain months, the Rosh Chodesh of certain months. And the Gemara is here discussing whether this is praiseworthy. And there's a statement of Shmuel, an early Achron, who says, no, anybody who sits and fasts, presumably more often than they should, is called a sinner. And this creates some consternation among later rabbis. How could Shmuel say this? Isn't it good to fast? And also Shmuel is contradicting himself, because they find a quote where elsewhere he says that it's a good thing to fast. So, there's a contradiction internally in the world of Shmuel as well. We're not going to focus on that. What we're going to focus on is how, in discussing whether somebody who fasts more often than they should is called a sinner or not. And we're going to focus on how that relates to the Nazir. So Rabbi Elazar Kapar Rabbi Omer. So Rabbi Elazar Kapar says, in the name of Rabbi, he says, Matamud Loma, what is the Torah teaching us in Parashat Naso, when it says about the Nazir, when he completes his term of office? Remember, I told you he brings 3 sacrifices, and one of them is a sin offering, right? And when he brings his offerings, it says that the Bible says, and he will atone, it will atone for him for that which he sinned upon his soul. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. The Talmud here isn't being as honest with you as I'm going to be honest with you. The verse is culled from not the regular completion service, which does mention a sin offering, but it doesn't mention sinning against his soul. Okay, the verse there is actually taken also from Parashat Naso, but talking about that ceremony I told you is done by the Nazir who breaks one of the terms of his or her Nazirut. So there it's clear what's being atoned for. It's what's being atoned for. The sin is that they made a vow and they weren't able to keep it. But Rabbi Elazar Kapara seems to say, no. These sacrifices, it doesn't matter which service, whether it's the service for the aborted Nazir or the service for the full Nazir, they both have a sin offering, right? And so they're both atoning, and they're both atoning for a sin. So what's the sin? What's the sin that's shared by every Nazir, not just the Nazir who fails to abide by the prohibitions that they took upon themselves? So I'll tell you what, what sin did he do against what soul? I'll tell you, he abstained from drinking wine. God allows us to drink wine. And he made himself suffer by making it a biblical offense to drink wine. But God never forbade that. And by making yourself suffer more than you need to, more than God asks you to, the Torah calls you a sinner. So why this is relevant to the background in the Sechet Tanet is it's saying, well, all the more so, somebody who makes himself not drink wine or water or orange juice or Coca-Cola and not eat, somebody who makes themselves fast when they're not commanded to fast, how much more so are they a sinner? So Rabbi Elazar HaKapar is using this view about a Nazir to defend what Shmuel said about people who fast in general. You shouldn't fast in general because God doesn't ask us to suffer more than we really need to, right? And where do we learn that from? We learn that from a Nazir. A Nazir is called a sinner, right? Why would you make yourself forbidden to do things that God didn't ab initio forbid you from doing? Right now, I see Elizabeth kind of maybe asking a question in her head that I'm kind of playing with in my head. Tell me if I'm right, Elizabeth. It's like, well, if God doesn't want people to forbid, to kind of extend the biblical prohibitions such that you become prohibited by the Bible from wine, let's say, don't have a legal category called a Nazir. God created these laws to begin with, right? If God doesn't want us to make vows that have like biblical weight to them, such that I could make wine forbidden to me as pork, right? Then don't create this institution. Is that what you were confused about, or is it something else?
Actually, I was wondering if this is, at least the later rabbis considered that the Torah was really making taking a stand against zealotry.
Yeah.
And also whether in all contexts, like when we get to, Samson, I mean, is it not considered praiseworthy?
Yes.
To be a Nazir?
Yeah.
Is it only considered praiseworthy if you've just got these, sort of outsized passions that, can't be contained within civil society? Right. So, yeah, those things.
That seems right. So because the question you need to ask is, why is there this legal instrument of becoming a Nazir if it's really not praiseworthy? And the answer, I think the most plausible answer is what you say, Elizabeth. There are some people, they're exceptional people, who have outsized passions, and it might be wise for them. So, for example, an alcoholic really shouldn't be permitted. They shouldn't permit themselves to have even just a little drink of whiskey with a friend one day. There's, oh, they can do it, I'll be fine. No, it's fine for most people, but if you really are suffering from alcoholism, from an addiction, it should be forbidden for you. But that's not for most people. And for most people, it would be repressive even. And the Bible just doesn't have a positive attitude towards aestheticism, or, at least that's what these rabbis this rabbi, Elazar ben Kapar, seems to be saying. So fine, maybe, but you might even argue that in the case of Shimshon, here's a very Freudian reading. The restrictions of being a Nazir were so repressive that his passions came out in other places. Right? His great lust wasn't for wine, right? It was for other things. Aestheticism, these sorts of extremes, they're not the mainstream of Judaism, and they were very rarely the mainstream of Judaism. And you go back to Nadav and Avihu, who got too close to the heavenly fire and it killed them. And there's some kind of danger around extremes of all sorts that the rabbis were kind of, or at least some of the rabbis were keenly aware of. Okay.
And there's no sexual prohibition associated with the Nazir.
That's interesting, right?
That's the big one.
Yes, and it's not there.
Yeah.
It's not there biblically. It's just the impurity of death, not the impurity of cohabitation, which also has a ritual impurity, but yeah, no, not forbidden. So it's interesting, right? And again, we want to ask, why just grapes, and why are we being commanded this now? Again, that's a question for another time. But if you carry on in this Talmudic discussion, the other Elazar says, no, no, no. You can't say that a Nazir is a sinner. Nikra Kadosh. The Nazir is called holy. As it says, also in Parashat Naso, Kadosh yiyeh gadel peira sa'ar rosho. He shall be sacred. He shall let the locks of his hair grow long. Right? So Elazar Kappa thinks that every Nazir is a sinner because it's not ideal to be prohibiting things that God actually allows. And maybe the reason you have to prohibit them is because you have led a life that has kind of unleashed passions that need to be withheld. Maybe it's appropriate sometimes to do it, but it's never ideal. There's a sense in which you're a sinner, says Elazar Kappa. And the other Rabbi Elazar says, I just can't accept that. I'm reading the same verses as you, and it only mentions the word sin in regard to a Nazir who breaks the terms of their Nazirut. Okay, admittedly, they bring a sin offering, come what may, but that just might be because it's a type of offering. It's called a sin offering, not because they actually sin, right? A woman, when she gives birth, she brings a number of offerings, and one of them's a sin offering. And some people say, oh, because she definitely sinned when she gave birth. How did she sin? Because every woman giving birth says things they don't mean. Like, I hate you, and I'm never doing this again, and okay. But another interpretation is no, it's just a formal name of one of the sacrifices, which is most often brought for sins, but it's sometimes brought in other ceremonies, like when the woman has given birth and she brings a number of offerings, and like the Nazir. It's not obvious that just because the Nazir brings a sin offering that he's really a sinner. And the only time the Nazir is explicitly called a sinner is the time when the Nazir accidentally, or on purpose, broke the terms of his or her vows. Now, if you carry on the source sheet, I quote from the commentary of the Ramban, a Spanish medieval commentator, who has a completely different reason for bringing the sin offering. He admits that the sin offering is because there is a sin, but the sin isn't becoming a Nazir. Let's have a look at what he says. He says, the reason for the sin offering that the Nazir brings, the Yom Mileit Yemei Nizro, on the day that he completes his Nazirite term, Lonit Paresh. It's not explained in the Bible. Why are they bringing a sin offering? And as I said, it might not be because they did a sin. It might be some sort of formal category. But that's not what Nachmanides thinks. This is what he thinks. He says, V'al derech hapshat, the most simple explanation is this. Ki ha'ish hazeh choteh nafsho. This person has sinned against his soul. Bimleot hanazirut, by completing his nazirut. Ki hu ata nazur mikdushato. Because from now, he's separating himself from the great sanctity he had when he was a Nazir. Va'avodat Hashem. He's now separating himself from that heightened level of religious service that he offered to God during his Nazirite term. V'ra'ui hayalo. It would have been fitting for him. Shi'azir la'olam. V'yamod kol yamav Nazir. It would have been fitting for him to be a Nazir forever, such that all of his days would have been lived within the confines of Nazirut, the Kadosh Lielohav, and he would have been sanctified to his God. If you want to know what the sin is stopping. So what you're seeing is there are two very different attitudes in the rabbis towards being a Nazir. One is kind of, as Elizabeth was articulating, it's a remedy for a non-ideal state of affairs. It's not for everybody to do, and you only need to do it because there's something unideal. It's to fix something. And, you know, to call these people really holy, it's just inappropriate, because if anything, right, it's a remedy for an unideal situation, and it involves something the Torah is not comfortable with, abstinence, which in a sense is a very minor form of self-harm, which the Torah doesn't like. That says one side. The other side says no. To be a Nazir is like to be elevated. It's like becoming a high priest voluntarily at your own will, and you live in this state of sanctity. The only reason you have to bring a sin offering at the end is because once you've elevated yourself to that level, there's something inappropriate about stopping. Okay, these are two very different attitudes towards the Nazir. Yes, Elizabeth.
I wonder if it's also what Nachmanides also means in part, that it's like a prophylactic atonement. You know, it's not that you've sinned at that moment.
Yes.
Going forward, you may.
You may do.
Without, yeah. And I'm thinking about, I think it's in Parashat Achrei, where there's an offering that is given to cleanse the altar itself.
Yes.
And which is, you know, which is very hard to understand.
Yeah. What's the altar done?
So
yes.
The holiness, is it that it may at some point become polluted, or
That's
that
right.
people expected too much from their
I think different explanations could be given, and some think it becomes polluted by insincere sacrifices, which we'll see later, or it becomes polluted by people who come to the temple not abiding by the strict purity codes that you're not really supposed to enter the temple but it's worth thinking about, because it looks like, if you read that Parashah very carefully, we'd have to go back, it looks like they're commanded to purify it, and atone for it, even before they've ever brought anything to begin with, right? So, you know, Tzarech Ian, we should study that at a later point. Now, I'm ready for what I call the Midrash of this week's Parashah. Yes, sorry, Debbie.
I wanted to say that the two ways of looking at it, it seems to me, is one, that it's a concession, that it's a response to a weakness in a person.
A weakness that a certain person might have. Like Elizabeth said, a prophylactic, against sin. Yes. Yes.
And on the other end of the spectrum, it's a way for a person to enhance and to raise themselves up.
Yes. Yes. And I think that might be the difference between Shmuel and Shimshon. I mean, you've got it for Shmuel, it was somehow a manifestation of a being who's just on a different level to most humans. He's just a very holy person, a very spiritual, religious person. And it's as if the 613 mitzvot are just not enough for him, because he's just so loves serving God. That's one model of Nazirut. And then you go, why wine? Well, it could have been anything. I don't care. It's just another mitzvah, right? Whereas the prophylactic case is a very different type of Nazir, a person who perhaps isn't, you know, naturally religiously gifted, naturally inclined to religious service, but has a good heart and wants to kind of guard against, you know, the base nature that he or she sometimes feels beholden to. So engages in the Nazirite vows as a prophylactic. These are two very different personalities. And it's a beautiful segue into the story I want to share with you, a story you can find both in Bamidbar Rabbah as a Midrash on Parashat Naso. You can also find it word for word in the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Nadarim. And I think what's very clear is, according to Shimon HaTzadik, who's one of the main characters in the story you're about to read, is nobody's right or wrong here. It's not that Elazar Kapar is right and the other Rabbi Elazar is wrong, or vice versa, and it's not that Nachmanides is right. It's exactly as Debbie's suggesting. There are different Nazirim. There are some who are the Nazir of the ideal type, and there are some that are the non-ideal type. But I actually think in Shimon HaTzadik's case, it becomes even more complicated or more sophisticated, perhaps. So let's have a look. Okay. So the context is, Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen. So he served in the temple. And as a Kohen, he was entitled to eat from the sin offerings of Jewish people. So when a person brought a sin offering, some of that meat would be cooked. It's a nice barbecue for the Kohanim serving on the temple that day. Okay, so he would have eaten from sin offerings he served before the destruction of the temple, Shimon Tzaddik. And he tells a story, and here's the story, and it will be familiar, I think, to lovers of Greek mythology. One second, I stupidly closed the source sheet, but I've got it open again. Okay, says Tanya, we learned in a Breita. This is I'm quoting now from the Nedarim 9b, but it's pretty much word for word in Bamidbar Rabbah the same. Amar Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik says, "Miyamai lo achalti Hasham nazir tamei el echad." I never once ate the guilt offering of a ritually impure Nazirite except once. Only one time. Now, I don't know what the function of the ritual impurity here is, because we're talking here about a Nazir who failed to remain pure. So this isn't a Nazir at the end of his service. This is a Nazir who failed in the midst of the service and is going to try again. I wouldn't be surprised from this story if Shimon HaTzadik never ate from the Korban Chatat of any Nazir, whether it was at the completion or at the point of interim failure. But let's have a look. What's the one time he ate? Ham Achad, one time. Ba Adam Echad Nazir min Hadron. A southern Nazirite man came to the temple. Ura Itib, and I saw him. Shehu Yafei Anayim, he had beautiful eyes. V'tov Ro'i, and he was good looking. V'kvutzotav sturot lo taltalim, his locks of hair were arranged in curls. Amarti lo, I said to him, Bani, ma ra'ita lahashchit et sa'arecha zehna'eh. Why did you decide to, what did you see that caused you to want to destroy this beautiful hair? Now, of course, he's not going to be destroying his hair until he finishes his service. But the idea is that, as I understand the story, he was a young man who anyway had long hair before he became a Nazir. His beautiful long hair. And sure, you might want to trim it, but to keep it in order. But why on earth would you commit to shaving it all off? Beautiful, right? Why are you committing to destroying this beautiful head of hair that you have? What caused this? What caused you to take this vow upon yourself? Amar Li, he told me, Ro'eh Hayiti, I was a shepherd, La'abba Be'iri, for my father in my hometown. Halachti lamala'ot mayim min ha'ma'ayan. I came to fill up water for the sheep, right, from the stream. V'nistakalti bababua shali. I saw myself in the mirror of the Ma'ayan. I saw my own reflection, right? And what happened to me? My desire, my Yetzer Hara in later terminology, my passions took hold of me, seized me, they jumped upon me, and they wanted to take me out of this world. This is the Jewish Narcissus, right? Narcissus sees his own reflection and falls in love with himself, with his own reflection, and it is his downfall. Well, what happens to the Jewish Narcissus. We'll read the continuation. Amarti lo, this is still the Nazarite saying, I spoke to him, meaning I spoke to my own Yetzer, I spoke to my own desire, and this is what I said, Rasha, wicked one, lama atam mitga'er ba'olam she'eino shalcha. Why are you so proud of a world that's not yours, right? And I think it's talking about the body that you occupy in this physical world is giving you pleasure, but this physical world has nothing to do with you, right? And you're taking pride in this body who is destined to be food for worms and maggots, right? Ha'avodah, which was an early way of swearing an oath. It means by the temple service. I'm going to shave you off to heaven. I don't want to ruin too much the punchline, and I want to get towards at the end that I'm trying to masterfully build up, in a specific way. But it seems to me that this isn't a classic case of the prophylactic Nazir that Elizabeth spoke of. I'll tell you why in a second. But it's also not the classic case of the kind of holy, otherworldly person who's just the one in a million who kind of operates on a different level to most people, Nazir, that perhaps Debbie conjured up for us. Because yes, he's trying to save himself from sin, but the way he wants to do it is by offering up the hair, the very hair that kind of is his sexual, or that embodies his sexual attractiveness. He wants to offer that up to God. So it's not like I'm swearing not to have wine because wine is a temptation to me, or I'm swearing to live a more aesthetic life to stay away from other temptations. Rather, he's not interested in the wine thing at all anyway. He says just, I swear by the temple service, I'm going to shave you off to heaven. But remember, in order to shave him off, he's actually going to have to wear it that length for 30 days. And he fails because he stumbles across impurity in this story, which means they're going to do another 30 days. So in actual fact, it means he's going to have to wear this hair for longer, right? Because that's the way in Nazir it works. In order to offer the hair up on the altar, you first have to go through a period of impurity, which you, sometimes through no fault of your own, you might stumble in, and it's going to take at least a month before he shaves it off. So it doesn't seem to me like it's the classic way that a person might use an oath as a prophylactic against sin. To say somebody who's addicted to alcohol might be very well advised to take a biblical oath, no longer to drink any alcohol, or somebody who's addicted to some other intoxicant or behavior or substance might be well advised to take a biblical oath. That's not quite what's happening here. Okay, let's carry on the story. Instead, he wants to take something that could have been an obstacle to him, and he wants to make that very thing, he wants to bring it to the altar. Miyad, immediately, says Shimon HaTzadik, Amadati unshaktiv. I stood up and I kissed him, Arosho, on his forehead. Amarti lo, B'ni, my son, Kamocha yirbu Nozrei Nazir Israel. If only there'd be more Nazirim like you. Alecha katuv omer. It's about you that the Torah is saying, Ish ki yaflilin dor neder nazir lahazir laHashem. When a man or woman shall clearly utter a vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to consecrate himself to Hashem. That's what you've done. You've done it right. Okay. All right. I love that Midrash, of course, and I love the parallel to Narcissus. What does it mean this is a question I want to ask when looking at this. What does it mean to dedicate one's beauty to God, right? And how did that, dedicating his beauty to God, help him to overcome the selfishness and the arrogance of the narcissist? I don't know if Shimon Tzadik or the authors of this story, if we're going to be a bit more source critical, I don't know if they knew about the narcissist story, but it's a parallel that's almost begging to be made, right? So how is this an antidote to narcissism? How is taking your beauty, recognizing it, not even repressing it, recognizing it, but somehow serving it up to God, how is that an antidote to the selfishness and arrogance of the narcissist, right? So opposition to the Nazirite, from Elazar Kapar all the way down to the Rambam, it tends to be rooted, and this is what the discussion between with Debbie and Elizabeth has helped to bring out so nicely. Opposition to the Nazir tends to be rooted in a general opposition towards extremism, right? Because if the Torah allows things such as wine, then all other things being equal, God wants you to enjoy them, right? In moderation. But it seems as if that wasn't the reason that Rav Shimon wasn't eating the sacrifices of the other Nazirites. He wasn't saying, oh, I hate you aesthetes, I hate you people who make your soul suffer by banning things. That, if I'm trying to unpack or reverse engineer, why if he ate this one, did he not eat the others? What was his general opposition? I think you can see in the text that he didn't believe that the others were really doing it for Hashem. Right? What does he say at the end? He says, you're the guy the Torah was talking about when he said that some people will do this for Hashem. Right? The implication being, these other guys, when they come, they're not really doing it for God. Right?
He was sincere.
He was sincere. It was real. Right? He was sincere. So, in fact, if you carry on in the Gemara, in the Darim, in the context where this comes up, there's another Rav called Rabbi Yonah, who tries to explain, well, that's not very nice of Shimon Tzadik not to be eating these sacrifices, right? It kind of implies they're not kosher or something, like, people might take offense, like, why weren't you eating them? Rabbi Yonah says this comes back to what Elizabeth was talking about, the impurity of the altar. Rabbi Yonah says, if a sacrifice isn't bought with pure intention, it's as good as unkosher. It's called pigul, which is when you've brought something impure into the sanctuary. And Shimon Tzadik, according to Rav Yonah, in the continuation of the Gemara, just didn't believe that most of the people who called themselves a Nazir were sincere. And since they weren't sincere, there's a real threat that their sacrifices aren't even kosher, so I'm not going to eat from them. Right? But this one, yeah, I give him a kiss and I eat from it. Right? How often is religious piety a veil for narcissistic pride? The Nazir is someone who walks around with their long hair and their long beard and saying, hey, I'm frommer than you. And they were recognizable. Okay. In Jewish history post-temple, there have been very few Nazirim, because you can't become a Naz, you can't end your Nazirut without a temple. But there have been some. The Talmud of Rav Kook, Rabbi David HaKohen, was a Nazir, and you can see photos of him. He's got his long beard. He's never shaved a day in his life, and it's a symbol, a status symbol. That long hair, and it's one just his beard, right? Lots of people have long. He didn't cut his hair, right? Long hair, which isn't. You don't see that in yeshiva very often. People with long, long hair, right? He stood out. And I'm reminded of a well-known joke about a yeshiva student who was renowned far and wide for his unrivaled humility and piety. He slept on a floor instead of a bed. He ate nothing but bread and water. He studied all day. And everywhere he went, he was accustomed to repeating under his breath, I'm a worm, I'm a worm, I'm a worm. Now, one day, a new student arrived at the yeshiva and he was deeply impressed by this example of his older peer. So instantly he began to imitate all of his ways. And everywhere he went, he would say, worm, worm, worm under his breath. But his role model was incensed at being upstaged and said, oh, really? Look who thinks he's a worm. He's been here 10 minutes and already he thinks he's a worm. We sometimes use our piety as immodestly, as a status symbol. And Rabbi Shimon was impressed only by one Nazirite, this young man who really wasn't doing it to look good. On the contrary, he knew that the end result of doing it would actually be to destroy his good looks. And it was because of that he could be sure that in this case, he could really believe that it was really being done for God. He, unlike the other Nazirim, he wasn't doing it so he could walk around for a few months with long hair so everyone would say, oh, look how holy he is. He was really doing it because he wanted his hair to be on the altar, to go up to Hashem, right? And the hero of this story, despite being deeply enamored by his own reflection, is not like Narcissus. He is the rabbinic anti-Narcissus, and he was holy to Hashem, right? And in a sense, all those other Nazirites, they are the narcissists, right? Or at least they're suspected of narcissism because their piety is a show, and they're in love with their piety, Now, years ago, I learned this Midrash in the Gemara, in the context in which it appears in the Gemara, which is in a discussion regarding two types of vow. To use the Hebrew terminology, there's one type of vow is called a neder, and one kind of vow is called a nedava. And it's very hard to understand the difference between the two in the context of Talmudic, dispute. They're both types of vow. In some contexts, it's easier to see the distinction. In other contexts, it seems like the distinction collapses. If you vow by making a neder to bring a sacrifice to the temple, that's going to create an obligation upon you to bring a sacrifice. If you make a vow by making a nedava, what you do is you create an obligation not upon a specific person to bring a sacrifice, but on a specific animal, that it should be brought as a sacrifice, right? So I've got Dolly, the sheep, in my farm. If I make a neder to bring a sacrifice, then I have to bring a sacrifice. Now it's going to be Dolly because she's the only sheep I've got, but the obligation's on me. No one else can do it for me even, or if they do, they have to be appointed as my agent, right? They have to do it on behalf, it's me that has to do it in some sense. And by the way, if I die, for example, I can't bring it after my death. And if I haven't appointed an agent to do it for me, it's too late. An adava, but it would be different. It's when I'd say, that sheep Dolly, I designate her a sacrifice. Now I don't have to bring it. I might die. Someone else can bring it, but it has to be a sacrifice. In that case, it's quite easy to see the difference between a neder and a nadava. There are other cases where it's harder, but in general, what you might think is a neder creates an obligation on a person, and in a sense, when you make a neder, it's a self-directed action because you're creating an obligation in yourself. Okay. Whereas an adava creates a more abstract debt that needs to be paid by someone, but not necessarily by you. So the sense in which the Nadaver is directed towards, put it this way, the Neder is directed towards me. The Nadaver is directed towards Dolly. If I made a Neder and Dolly dies, I have to bring a different sheep. It's on me. If I made a Nadaver out of Dolly and Dolly dies, I don't need to bring another one. It was on Dolly. So in a sense, the Neder is directed towards the person. The Nadaver is directed towards the world, towards the action that's going to be done, right? The change that's going to be made. Now, we've only got 4 minutes for me to try and tie this circle up, but regarding the sacrifices, the Talmud teaches that scrupulous people, for one reason or another, they always preferred to make a Nadaver over a Neder. And ostensibly that's because they feared Hashem to such an extent that they didn't want to make any commitments that they were afraid they couldn't keep. What if I die before I'm able to do it, for example? And now you might worry about a Nadaver. Well, what happens if Dolly becomes incapacitated? So they had a strategy. They didn't make any Neders. They didn't make any Nadavers. They brought the sheep to the temple, and just before they sacrificed it, they made a Nadaver. And that was just the most scrupulous way of doing things, so that, because people never want their words, not to be fulfilled by some dint of some accident or other. But perhaps there's another reason why the righteous prefer a Nadaver to a Neder. And it's because the righteous don't like their deeds to be self-directed. And Neder is about taking an obligation upon yourself. It's about you actually undergo a halakhic transformation when you make a Neder. You become a person with a new obligation upon your shoulders. But religious service isn't about you. Religious service is about the world. It's about making sure sacrifices are brought, not making sure that you have an obligation to bring a sacrifice. It's a subtle point, but it's there. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is when I was learning this passage in yeshiva, I was studying under the tutelage of this amazing rabbi called Rav Shmuel Nachum. And he asked me this question, and I had no clue what he was talking about. He said, in this story that we just read, there's a kiss and there's a barbecue. Shimon HaTzadik kisses the Nazir and he eats from the barbecue. And he said to me, right, so Rabbi Shimon tells a story about a man and his sacrificial meat. He kisses one of them, the man and not the meat. He eats the other, the meat and not the man, right? But how are the two related? The eating from the barbecue and the kissing of the kiss. Might he have eaten from the barbecue without feeling compelled to kiss its owner? And he also asked me this really strange question, but which did he do first? Did he eat the meat first and kiss the Nazir second, or did he kiss the Nazir first and eat the meat second? And for years, I never really understood what he was trying to get me to think about or to answer. But basically, I think that he may have been pointing towards the direction of fit. What I mean is this. I came to see this. If you'll oblige me just 2 more minutes, please leave if you can't stay on. But I was learning this very obscure philosophical debate between two contemporary philosophers, Kit Fine and Fraser McBride, and it's the sort of thing that makes you just give up on philosophy. Like, philosophy is so ridiculously obscure sometimes, and here you are. Okay, when you've got a cat sitting on a mat, you also have a mat underneath the cat. You can't have those two things happen without one another. If there's a cat on a mat, there's also a mat under a cat. Question: how many facts are there? Kit Fine says there's one fact. It's a fact about the kind of vertical placement of cat and mat. And there's just 2 ways of describing it. You could describe it as the cat's on the mat. You could describe it as the mat's under the cat. But they're just one fact, 2 different ways of describing it. Whereas Fraser McBride says, no, it's very important. There are 2 facts here. They always come together, but they're two distinct facts. There's the mat under the cat and the cat under the mat. Oh, well, if you want to know what they're arguing about, they're actually arguing about direction. Is direction something fundamental in the world? There's two facts, one that starts with the cat and ends with the mat, and there's another fact, one that starts with the mat and ends with the cat. And these are two different facts distinguished by the very different direction in which they move. And Kip finds says, no, the world has no real direction. It's just, you know, language cuts things up one way or another. Okay, what on earth, how on earth did this help me? Right? From the outside, all you see is a cat and the mat. You know, both facts look the same, right? So too, the genuine Nazir and the non-genuine Nazir, they look the same. Now, for most Nazirites, according to Rabbi Shimon, their public acts of piety were really directed upon themselves. They were not truly for God. The direction went from the deed of being a Nazir onto them, right? So in a sense, they had only made a neder to become a Nazir. But for this one anti-Narcissus, his identical deed flowed in the opposite direction. They flowed from him onto his hair, right? He'd made a nadava out of his hair. It wasn't about him. It was about making sure that that hair got offered up to God. And this direction was actually mirrored in Rabbi Shimon's movement. First, he kisses the man, and then he eats the meat. It goes in the direction of from the person doing the deed to the deed. And that's what makes it holy, right? So our Torah reading describes, so the conclusion I want to end with is that Parashat Naso, the text of itself, is really ambiguous. It describes the Nazir, sometimes in ways that could make him look like a saint. Lahazir laHashem, Nezer Kodesh al Rosha. It says he has like this crown of holiness on his head, but there's also the textual implication that he's a sinner. Not just when he accidentally breaks the terms of the vow, but he has to bring a sin offering at the end. And the way that Rabbi Shimon relates to this is that most Nazirim were sinners posing as saints. But one of them was a sinner who became a saint by dedicating to Hashem the beauty that had threatened to lead him astray. And I actually think in this Midrash, you get a much richer dialectic than, oh, some people are a Nazir to stop themselves sinning, and some people are a Nazir because they're really, really holy. This one, Shimon HaTzadik's Nazir, is in neither camp. He somehow uses his, what might in other people be a weakness, he uses that very thing to serve Hashem. There you go. So that prepares you for Parashat Naso in 2 weeks' time, unless you all quickly make Aliyah to Israel, where you'll be reading Parashat Naso this Shabbat. It's been my great privilege to share with you Midrashim on the weekly Parsha, and we will reconvene when Drisha's next semester begins.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Chag Sameach. Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lebens. This has been an amazing Zman of learning, and I'm looking forward so much to the next one. And thank you so much to all of our participants for being part of our learning community and your great comments and questions and insights. I just want to let you all know that tonight we're having a special pre-Shavuot program with Rabbinic Victoria Sutton, 613 mitzvot in rhyme, the tradition of Azharot.
Azharot.
Yes. So it's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up on at drisha.org. And hopefully I will see you all again next month.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Bye.